everybody. Welcome to week 8. I'm super excited about this week because this is just a topic that's near and dear to my heart. This idea of fostering and teaching self-determination skills to students, and then ultimately having them lead their own IEP meetings has probably been one of the most rewarding experiences I've had teaching. So I hope that you find that as well. And it's possible that you're already doing some of these things with your students, but if not, I hope that this week's lecture and reading and resources really help you to kind of dive into this. So with that, let's go ahead and get started and talk about our learning intentions for this week. So hopefully after this week, after you've done the reading and listened to this discussion, and looked at some of the resources that you will be able to describe what self-determination is and why it's so important to students with disabilities to learn and practice these skills while they're still in school, and also, through that transition to adulthood. But it really starts early. And our second learning intention is that you will be able to explain why it's important to have students be an active participant and eventually lead their own IEP meetings. And I'm going to share a lot of resources with you on how to do that. And the third one is I really want you to be comfortable with and know where to find these resources and strategies. And there is quite a bit out there around teaching self-determination. There's a lot of really great websites. I've linked some of those in the Canvas course. It definitely is a process. It's definitely not a one and done. We've developed some tools here at the State Board of Education. We have a Padlet on self-determination, and we have an app that I'm going to walk you through also that helps students really prepare and take an active role in leading their own transition IEP meeting. So I hope that after this week, you will feel like you have some strategies, some tools, some things to use in your practice so that you don't feel like you are building this from scratch, because that is certainly not the idea. There's a lot out there. All right, so let's start really with there are many definitions around self-determination, but I think the one that we often refer to, especially in education, is by these researchers that have done a lot of work around this idea of what does self-determination look like and what does it mean for students with disabilities. So essentially, it is a dispositional characteristic manifested as acting as the causal agent in one's life. So people that are self-determined feel like they are empowered to kind of freely choose things that happen in their life, to set goals, determine actions, and to really have this control over what happens to them. And I think this is also true of our students with more complex needs, although that might not be as obvious, right? Especially students that don't use verbal words to communicate necessarily. And so, we can talk a little bit about what that looks like. So that's really that overall definition of self-determination. I think sometimes we lump self-advocacy and self-determination together, where self-advocacy really is one part of self-determination. But self-determination really encompasses lots of different concepts. So we're going to talk about those right now. So I think first and foremost, part of self-determination really is the ability to make choices. So choosing between a finite number of choices, which is harder. I definitely found that my students in post-high, and these were 18 to 22-year-old students, really didn't have a lot of experience making choices. And so that was really difficult for them. So sometimes we had to limit their choices, which kind of comes to the next concept of decision making, which really involves choosing between some limited or unlimited options, right? So choice making is you're kind of controlling maybe just 2 options to begin with if students haven't had a lot of experience with choice making. And then decision making is so many options we have as individuals, and how do you then kind of figure out how to make decisions and act on those. So decision making and choice making are certainly very related and similar, but choice making, having somebody kind of limit those choices for you. And I think that's a good place to start, especially with students that haven't been able to make a lot of their own decisions or choices. I know from my experience, I had students that, wouldn't even choose what they would wear or what they would eat or, what they would watch, like even just very basic choices they weren't making themselves. All right, we'll go on to the next one, goal setting and attainment. And it's interesting. We obviously, as special ed teachers, are writing a lot of goals for students, setting a lot of goals for students, but are we really teaching them how to do that for themselves, or are we modeling that openly so that they can see what goal making is like, right? And what that involves and how important that is to be able to do. And we're talking about, daily goals, weekly goals, long-term goals, all of the above. And then problem solving. I think that sometimes in special education, we don't want our students to encounter problems, so we kind of swoop in and solve those problems for them. But I think some of the best learning that happens for all of us really is by sometimes failing and then figuring out how to do things differently the next time, right? So we've all, I think, can relate to ourselves and how we've learned to problem solve, and how that makes us grow. And so that idea of weighing pros and cons, of potential actions, identifying barriers to success. So I think sometimes we almost want to set up situations where our students have to problem solve, and then we have to just be really patient, I think, and quiet and let them struggle a little bit and figure out how to solve problems before we swoop in. So these four areas are certainly components of self-determination, but that's not it. There are more. I think it also really starts with self-awareness. So I get the question a lot, okay, if we're supposed to start this idea of self-determination early in a student's school career, so even as early as preschool, so you guys that are in elementary, self-awareness is where we start with this idea of self-determination. Um, are students aware of just their own strengths, their likes, their dislikes, where they shine, where they need more help, where they need improvement? So that is a really, really great place to start around this idea of becoming more self-determined. It's just this awareness. And then self-efficacy. So that understanding that your own actions have an impact and that you are the driving force in your life. So I think a lot of times our youth feel like, adults all around me are telling me what to do, and they're making all these decisions for me. And so it really doesn't matter what I think. And so I think, we need to kind of set up situations where students do have a voice, and then they can see that their actions do directly impact what happens to them in their life, and that it isn't adults doing things to them. So that's that idea of self-efficacy. And then I mentioned before, we hear this term self-advocacy a lot, and self-advocacy is super important for students with disabilities, really for anyone, but it is part of self-determination. It is really not a separate thing. But what self-advocacy is essentially is having a knowledge first and foremost of yourself. So I think for students with disabilities, it involves really them understanding their disability. I was just in a student focus group at a middle school last week, and it was so interesting because a lot of students there openly talked about what their disability was. And these were, seventh and eighth graders. And they talked about what their accommodations are on their IEP and how they asked, for those accommodations with their gen ed teachers. So that was like a perfect example of these students already advocating for themselves, saying, I have autism and it's okay. And this is how I learn best. And sometimes I need breaks, and, I need extended time on tests. I need a quiet place to test. And it was like this perfect example of students, somebody had worked with them, whether that was parents or maybe their teachers, but they really seemed to kind of have this sense of self and this knowledge about them, and then also of their right to accommodations and how to communicate that. And then that can even go into leadership ability, right? So we have a big focus on our state right now around trying to kind of foster this idea of leadership and disability pride, and having students advocate for themselves and also be kind of models and mentors for younger students around this idea of self-advocacy. So that's a huge part of self-determination. And then self-regulation, which I'm sure many of you are working with students that, don't have this skill yet. And I would say many adults have a hard time self-regulating, right? Because this involves a lot. It's like controlling your own behavior, kind of self-management, knowing what kind of triggers you, right? Being able to accept constructive feedback, self-monitoring, sort of knowing when you're, on track and when you're not. All right. I used to have students track their own behavior and I would track it as well. And then at the end of the day, I'd have a conversation with my students like, how do you think you did today on your job site or in this interaction with an adult? Or how were you with your peers? Whatever their goal was, I would have them really evaluate themselves and then I would evaluate them too. And we'd have a conversation about it because I think it takes practice for students to be able to self-monitor and self-evaluate. And sometimes they're kind of off base, they think they've done great. And that maybe not be the case. So, but they have to be able to accept that feedback and then move on. So self-regulation is something, that we can also start really early on, I think, in a student's educational career. So think about all of those concepts that really make up self-determination. And I want you to think for a minute about how these concepts have impacted your life. So, do you feel like maybe looking back that you didn't have some opportunities or you weren't taught some of these skills? And did that negatively impact you kind of moving forward? Or, thinking back, do you have experiences maybe where teachers or your parents or another mentor or another adult in your life really helped you kind of foster some of these skills around self-determination? So I think, a lot of those things kind of shape who we are today and, how you were able to be successful, right? I think we all have to figure out how to advocate for ourselves, know what our strengths are, set goals. All of those things kind of play into being a successful adult. So think about that in terms of your own life. And then think about the students that you work with or others, individuals in your life that have a disability. So maybe it's a child or maybe it's a family member. Do those individuals with disabilities that are in your circle have those same opportunities? Right. And I think sometimes the answer to that might be like, maybe in some areas they do, but in a lot of areas they don't. And why is that? Like, are we kind of missing that piece? I know we get super busy with all of the other things we have to do as educators and as parents. But I would, challenge you to kind of stop and think like, how can we start to implement some of things? How can we foster this? How can we teach it? How can we encourage it? How can we work with parents? I think we can't address self-determination and self-advocacy without bringing parents into the picture on this, right? I used to have my parents, I would invite them a lot to come to my program, my classroom, and I was kind of amazed at the things that they would just do for their student and answer for them and not really allow them to kind of, encourage some of those self-determination skills that we were fostering at school. And so it was important for me to have a conversation with parents to say, this is really important that we give students a chance to make choices and advocate for themselves and figure things out. And so, yeah, reflect on that for a minute and the kind of your own practice. What are you currently doing and what, could you change? And how could you start to change some of those things in your school or in your setting? All right, so let's kind of operationally define, since there's so much under self-determination, I think to kind of summarize it, it really is this ability to make choices because, as adults, our entire lives, we're constantly making choices, big ones, medium ones, little ones, large ones. So think of it in terms of making choices, solving problems, setting goals, evaluating those options, pros and cons, taking initiative to reach one's goals and then accepting the consequences of one's actions. That kind of like in a nutshell is like what we do as adults, right? So if we want our students to be successful adults, we really need to kind of break this down, look at all of this and figure out, how do we teach this? How do we provide lots of opportunities for practice? Because if students leave our schools and they haven't had much opportunity for practice in a safe environment where we can kind of talk them through it and support them, it's a lot scarier when they're trying to figure these things out in the workplace. It means they're getting fired or, on a college campus, it means they're failing classes or their professor, is not really going to be able to support them necessarily, right? So we want lots of opportunities for students to be able to practice and fail in a safe space, and that's at school. Um, I always say, start early. That's been a theme, I think, throughout transition. Transition, again, does not just start at 14. We want to think about these things super early on. Utilize a student-driven IEP process to allow students to demonstrate self-awareness, goal setting, problem solving, and self-advocacy. So I think we have to be careful not to just only encourage self-determination and self-advocacy through the IEP process. So I think it's really scary when students haven't had any practice around this, and all of a sudden we're saying, hey, guess what? Your IEP's next week and you're going to talk, right? That's intimidating. And so we really want to make sure that we are providing lots of support around, first and foremost, just self-awareness. Can the student talk for 30 seconds about their strengths, interests, preferences, and needs, for example? That's a good place to start. Does the student know how to set a goal? Can they problem solve? Do they know anything about their accommodation? So we want to do some groundwork way before we want to just say, oh, you're going to talk at your IEP and you're going to say all these things. So think about that. But I think all that work we do up front really sets them up for success, to be comfortable and to drive that IEP. And it's so cool for not only the student to experience that empowering kind of process, but for parents. I had many parents say, wow, that was like the coolest IEP I've ever been to, because I've never seen my student talk like that or take charge. So it is super powerful. I think another thing we want to make sure we're doing is to collaborate with general education teachers to embed this kind of thing, right? So sometimes general ed teachers, maybe, they have a student with a disability in their classroom, but they don't really understand that how important self-determination is. So allowing opportunities in the general ed setting to make choices and to set goals and to really provide those opportunities for practicing self-determination skills. And I think that just takes a conversation with your gen ed teachers to say, maybe we're not going to send this student with a para for the first 10 minutes because we want them to come in and ask, what they need to do. Or we're trying to really foster those self-determination skills. So we're going to take away a little bit of support, but tell the gen ed teacher that, right? Because sometimes gen ed teachers panic when they don't see a paraeducator or a peer tutor or someone supporting that student. But if they know it's an intentional practice or skill that the student's learning, that's great, right? But it takes communication. And then oftentimes we forget this, but with our students with more significant disabilities, we have to make sure that they have a functional communication system. So if we are working on choice making and the student doesn't use verbal skills, then we have to make sure that they have an augmentative device that they use that they're comfortable with, or a switch to make choices, right? Same with things like goal setting, taking initiative and accepting consequences for their actions. So don't discount, if you work with students with more complex needs, that this can still be done. It just takes a little more planning, I think, right? To make sure that the student has access to some sort of a functional communication, and that everybody's trained on it, right? So that the gen ed teacher knows how to maybe prompt the student, or the gen ed teacher understands the device they're using. Same with peer tutors, paraeducators, everybody's on the same page. So, but we don't want to leave those students out. All right, I always say start small. So, when I started doing student-led IEPs, it was a little intimidating. Like, I didn't really know where to start. And I thought, well, you know what? I'm just going to jump in. I'm going to start with one student. I would sit down with them and talk about their previous IEP goals, and I would have them rate themselves. And then, I would have a conversation about, like, what do you think you're good at? What do you think you've improved in? What are some areas that you think, you need to improve in? What are some goals you want to accomplish this year? What are future goals? So I'd have this like pre-IEP conversation with the student, and we would write this all down, and I would compare my progress notes with how they kind of rated themselves on their goals. And then I would provide them like a checklist, essentially, of what they were going to do during the IEP and how that was going to flow, and what were they comfortable with. Did they want to start with introductions? Did they want to talk about things they love about school? Do they want to talk about their strengths? And so again, we would have this prep session essentially. Um, and then so when they got to the IEP, they felt ready and prepared to jump in. And that looked different depending upon the students. Sometimes I had students do that on an iPad with pictures and I would prompt them because they didn't have the verbal skills. And I had other students that could read really well and had verbal skills, and the checklist worked really nicely. So there's lots of different ways you can do it. I've embedded some links here because I have like my favorite website of all time to start this idea of self-determination and student-led IEPs is called imdetermined.org. I linked it in the Canvas course. But I would suggest starting, if you haven't done anything around this, start with the one pager of the student spin. So there's these nice, colorful one pagers where students just, you can work with them to identify their own strengths, things, their preferences, their interests and needs, areas where they need help. They can add pictures to this document. They can write, somebody can write for them. You can do it all different ways, but it is just a really simple one pager to kind of start this idea of self-awareness. And even if a student shares that out at the IEP, and that's the first thing they do, if they're a younger student or they haven't had any experience, it's a really great place to start. So that's the one pager. Another great place to start, again, same website, imdetermined.org, has something called the Goal Plan Tool. And this teaches students to set goals, because I think, this concept of setting goals might be really new to a lot of students. And it is, again, just a super easy one-page tool to teach students how to set goals. So I'd suggest if you're really new at that, check that out too. Again, that idea of embedding these skills throughout the day. So you might say, well, I don't have time to carve out time to do these things. Figure out how you can embed them, whether that's during a study strategies class, whether that's in a regular ed class. This might be a great activity for all students to do. So you could come in to a gen ed class and say to the teacher, hey, I'm teaching my students how to set goals or how to have some more self-awareness. This might be a great activity for all students. So it's not just for special ed students. So think of creative ways, I think, to kind of get some of this instruction and practice in throughout the day. And then I mentioned before, I don't think we can do this in isolation without really involving our parents. So letting them know that you're doing this, that, there's a focus on this idea of self-determination. There's also research behind it. If parents are going to say like, why, right? There's a lot of research to say that if students are more self-determined, they have better outcomes while they're in school and after, right? So there's plenty of research that says that the why behind it. But I think, if you have parents on your side or in your corner, they're going to promote these things at home too. And that's what we want. We don't want to just have this happen at school and not carry over into their life at home with family and out in the community. So again, imdetermined.org, one of my favorite websites, has a brochure that is connected to that link where it says involve parents. And, you don't have to create it yourself. If you like the brochure, it really talks about how important self-determination is and how the parents can really help encourage that and foster that. So again, use tools that are out there. But I think that communication with parents will go a long way. Yeah, because then you're both working on the same thing. And then the last bullet here, assess students' level of IEP participation. So once you maybe have had a student participate in their IEP, whatever that might look like, even if it's just introductions, sharing their spins worksheet, that kind of a thing, or if they're doing the whole thing, there is a really nice, quick little, I think it's 2 pages, a rubric that you can sit down with the student and kind of evaluate, like what was their level of participation. So there's a lot of research around, I probably should have started with this, but there's a lot of research around the percentage of time that students actually talk at their IEPs. And so there's been studies where, let's say it's an hour and a half IEP, and they actually studied like the percentage of time that the special ed teacher spoke during the IEP, right? Which was a lot, probably like 50 to 60%. And the admin and, the gen ed teachers and parents. Well, basically what they found is only 3% of the time is the student actually speaking at their IEP. So that's not much, right? So for an hour and a half, that's like a minute. So we really want to change that. We want the student to talk a whole lot more at their IEP. But this rubric can be helpful because it kind of is like a not like a pretest, but it's a way to assess, are they comfortable? Do they even know that they're on an IEP? Do they know what it's for? Did they get to contribute to any parts of their IEP? And the IEP document itself is kind of daunting, right? Like it's got a lot of legal language. I would not suggest having a student read the actual IEP or the draft, but we want to take components of that and and break that down and use different tools for the students to have an active participation. But I would definitely not suggest giving them the IEP document because that's even confusing for parents, let alone for students. But there's lots of other tools. So I would suggest you take a look at this rubric. And it's a really nice tool to kind of assess, what level are they participating and where should we go next? Where are they now and what's next? All right, some more ideas to incorporate self-determination. Have students set daily goals in their classroom that tie to learning objectives. So, even when they walk in the morning, what's their daily goal? Maybe it's just to have a good day and to whatever, stay on task. Maybe it's a behavior kind of a goal. Maybe it's a responsibility goal, getting to and from classes on time. It can really be anything, but like bring it to their level and tie it to their IEP goals and have them start to kind of be responsible for setting goals and then assess themselves at the end of the day. Allow them to monitor their own behavior, which is exactly what I just said. Allow them to then evaluate how did they do on that goal that they set for themselves. I think there's a lot more buy-in when students are setting their own goals. And then when they monitor their own behavior, it means a whole lot more than when someone else has set that goal for them. And wait for and teach them to ask for help. So like, again, I said, a lot of times we swoop in. You might want to be intentional. Like if a student has a checklist of things they need to do, maybe you intentionally leave some things out of sight. So let's say they have to go gather a bunch of materials for a science experiment. You might leave some things out so that they actually now have to advocate and go up to the teacher and say, where is, the scale or the test tubes or whatever they're working with. So kind of being intentional about creating opportunities for them to need to use their communication skills and their self-advocacy skills for help. And then offer opportunities throughout the day for students to make choices. So I think choices is always great, especially students that we feel like we have power struggles with, right? Where, you ask them to do an assignment and their first reaction is no. If we offer them choices in the order they want to do things or choices in what assignments they're completing, who they're sitting with. I mean, there's so many ways we can implement choices, but that's a great skill. And then when they make that choice, they then have to live with the consequence, right? Because they've made it. So that's kind of empowering. So think about ways that you can incorporate those kinds of things, and then creative ways to involve students in their IEP. So I mentioned before, there's all different ways students can participate in their IEP, but even just starting with like making an invitation. So if the student knows their IEP is coming up and, you can have a discussion about, well, who's coming? Who do you want to invite? Which teachers, which, family members, they can make invitations, present work samples, pictures, drawings, collages. So have them bring stuff. I'll never forget when I went to my own kids' middle school parent-teacher conference. And all of a sudden it was so different from like elementary to middle. They ran the conference and I didn't see a teacher until like the very end of the evening. But my kids themselves, when they were in sixth grade, they were showing me work samples and they were showing me all these things that they did. And it was very student-led parent-teacher conference, same kind of concept. They can do the same thing at an IEP. Doing introductions, maybe they're held accountable to introducing everyone, all their teachers, their family to each other. That's a great way to get them comfortable with talking to adults and having that role. And then developing or facilitating the agenda. What should we talk about first? Should we talk about the things that you love? Do you want to talk about your future? Do you want to talk about the new club you joined? Right? Like having them kind of set that agenda so that it starts on a positive note and that, they feel like this active participant and that everyone's there to sort of celebrate them. Asking prepared questions. So that's kind of that checklist sheet that I talked about that I created for my students. So I would try to, have them, they had something to look at, right? So if they felt like, oh my gosh, what do I do now? What do I do next? They had those kind of prepared questions or a checklist in front of them. And then sharing progress and goals. I feel like this is so powerful. If you can just simplify the goal for the student, right? Maybe not with all the criteria and everything the way we write SMART goals, but to have the students speak to their own goals and how they've done. Very powerful. Sharing that one pager spin document, also a great way to start. And then I've seen a lot of this, but students are now oftentimes putting all of these things onto a PowerPoint presentation or Google Slides, whatever you use, but some sort of presentation. And that could even include pictures and videos. So that's a great way, or some other electronic tool, because I'm going to share with you something that we created a few years back at the State Board of Education called our Transition Elevated Planning app. And that's where I'm going to go next. I'll talk a little bit about it. So this was an app that was developed for students to specifically be able to prepare and present their transition plan. So we'll go into it in a minute, but essentially it is a web-based app. It also can be downloaded from the App Store and the Google Play Store, so it can be done on a tablet or a phone, or you can just go to transitionelevated.org because there's a web-based version. And it essentially asks the student about 15 questions. And then from that, all the answers to those 15 questions, it generates a draft transition plan. And it literally mimics all of those components that we talked about in I think it was week 2 or week 3, when we went through all the 8 components that are on the transition plan. So it really mimics that transition plan, but the student can speak to it. So it obviously starts with their interests, the classes that they like, then their long-term goals, then maybe what transition services they think they need, what courses they want to take. So I'm going to show you in a minute what that looks like. I do want to say a couple of things. I would definitely not take this app and just like hand it to a student and say, go for it. Or like, prepare for your IEP, because there's a lot of vocabulary in there that they may not understand. So I created a Padlet that kind of breaks down the vocabulary, the questions that are actually in there so you can see them. And I would say, teach some of those things first. Teach what transition is all about, that we do some assessments, and then we talk about long-term goals, and then we figure out our transition needs and pick classes. So like, you're having a conversation, you're using some of these elements to kind of teach students about transition before you would just tell them to go to the app and complete all the questions and generate that plan. The other thing I want to say about this too is that it is not, a student can do it as many times as they want. So in other words, there's not a password. They can't go back. So once they start answering the questions in the app, they have to finish. Or if they don't finish, they'll just pick it up another day. So I guess what I'm saying is they could practice this a bunch of times before they actually would present it at an IEP or share it out. Actually, a great idea would be to, teach some of the vocabulary, have lots of conversations about what transition is and all the components of their plan, then have them maybe finish the app, and then they could present it to their peers or to you or, their families, for example, before they do it at an IEP. So let me stop sharing really quick, and I'm going to show you what it looks like. And I probably won't go through all of it, but I would love to have you guys, my computer's being really slow. I'm trying to stop sharing. I'd love to have you guys practice this yourselves. So in other words, pretend you are a student and go in and play with the app. Really just become comfortable with it. There's 2 ways to get there. You can certainly go straight to that transitionelevated.org, and that will take you to the web-based version, which looks like this. This is where the app starts, but I want to point out first the Padlet. So we created a Padlet because we really felt like it was important that student or that's teachers have a few other resources before they just launch into it. So there's a demo video here. There's the links to getting onto the website itself. And then this shows you how you can find it in the iTunes or the Google Play Store. I did mention earlier there's a paper version. So right here, I want to just show you that really quick. So definitely before you um, present this to students, this is essentially the paper version of all the questions that are getting asked in the app. So I would take a look at this and make sure that you've gone over some of these things, like pull vocabulary, have conversations around what this is. Even things like, I'm interested in information for jobs in the following career clusters. Well, if students haven't done any career assessments, they probably don't know words like agricultural, food and natural resources, or architecture and construction, right? So some of these concepts around career clusters, there should be some assessment and some conversation prior to jumping into this app where they're making these decisions, right? Um, so that's the paper version. And I also wanted to show you what the draft IEP looks like. So once they have completed all the questions, and we're going to go in a minute and I'll show you what it looks like, it automatically creates a draft transition plan. And this is what it looks like. And it says how to use the Utah Transition Elevated app to prepare for your transition IEP. So it talks about, tips for making a successful transition IEP. And this is also great to share with parents because a lot of times parents are so confused about the whole transition process and what it all entails. So this is just as useful, I think, for your parents as it is for your students. So that's kind of the title page. Then starting on page 1, this is the actual students' results from going through it. So this is not a real student, but his name is Tommy, 10th grade. He's 16 years old. He's going to be attending his own IEP. And then this About Me section is everything he wrote in there. So his hobbies are drawing and riding horses. He's currently involved in FBLA and the Interact Club. He'd like to learn more about extracurricular activities. He volunteers at the food bank. So these are all things that he put into the app about him so he can share that out. And then it goes into what his goals are after high school. He wants to attend a 2-year university. He would like to be a hotel manager. So these are his post-secondary goals. He's just identified his education post-secondary goal, his employment, and then independent living. He would like to live in an apartment or a house with a roommate or friend, and he wants to be able to drive. So these are things that he answered in the app, and now they are automatically generated into this plan. There's a section here that says transition and related assessments. So it says, let's talk about the results of my age appropriate transition assessments. So if, best case scenario, the special ed teacher has done some nice transition assessment, maybe summarize that in a PLAF-up. And this is a great opportunity for the student to talk about what assessments they did. Maybe it was a career cluster, maybe it was a self-determination assessment, maybe it was an independent living assessment, and they can talk about that, right? What were their strengths? What are their needs? And that goes in that transition assessment section. And then it really breaks down their post-secondary goals, some experience they've already had. The student has already done some babysitting, volunteered at the food bank. Then it embeds, possible pre-ETS, so pre-employment transition services the student might need. So it asks the question, do you need more support, before you get a job, essentially is what it asks. And this student answered yes, they want support around exploring career interest, and they want help with a resume, creating a resume, job applications. They want to learn more about interview skills. They're kind of nervous about job interviews, and they want to share career fair opportunities to support and to know where they can go find out more about careers. Then it talks about, well, what kind of accommodations might they need? So this is a question in the app too. So when the student has a job, they might need to ask for things like some frequent breaks or a bigger computer screen if they have visual impairment, or maybe they need a job coach, additional time to learn new tasks. So here's where they're like identifying maybe accommodations that they're receiving in school that they would also need on a job. So those are those transition needs. So essentially the app asks them all these questions and then puts it into this format that really exactly mimics the transition planning process, right? That's embedded in the IEP. There's goals for self-advocacy, courses of study. Well, the student said that they wanted to go into hotel management, restaurant management. So they should take some foods classes or some health science classes. So the student gets to actually identify what courses they should take that help support those post-secondary goals. And then we have that connection with outside agencies. So what's really nice about this is it embeds it. So let's say the parent, they have no idea about outside agencies, but vocational rehabilitation, right? That's an agency they probably should look into and connect with. The links are embedded in this. So that's the nice part of it is a student can click on those links and learn more about it. The parents can click on those links and learn more about it. So once this plan is generated after the student has gone through all of those questions, they can print it, it's a PDF, or they can email it to all of their IEP team, or they can copy and paste parts of it and put it onto a slide presentation. That might be a kind of more fun way for students to actually share their draft plan. So there's lots of ways, and I've seen teachers do it different ways. Let me just quickly go. I know I'm taking up more time than I anticipated, but essentially this is what the home page looks like. So it says this app will help you create a draft transition plan. It was designed for students with IEPs, but really anyone can use it. So a student with a 504 plan could use it, but it's really designed for students with IEPs because it mimics that transition plan. And then it says if you're 14, and the transition plan then becomes part of your IEP. So it's sort of teaching along the way too. And then it says your transition plan is a roadmap for your future. This app is not designed to take the place of a transition assessment. So it is really a tool to help students understand the transition plan and families, but is not to be used as an assessment only. So there's some instructions here. I'm going to pop down to the frequently asked questions because I think this is a really cool embedded document. It has all kinds of questions and answers. Who's the app designed for? What is post-secondary transition? What is transition assessment? What are transition services? What are pre-ETs? What is vocational rehabilitation? So like all of these questions and answers around everything related to transition. So this is a really great thing. Maybe not so much for students, it's pretty text heavy, right? But I think for parents and especially for teachers, if they're kind of new to the whole transition, concept and have never really written transition plans before, this frequently asked questions document that's embedded in the app, I think is just a really great place to start if people are unfamiliar. But the student would go to start a transition plan. So they would click that and they would say, okay, right now, how old am I? Am I 14 or 15 or 16 and older? So let's pretend the student is 16. And so they click that, then they click their grade. Let's say the student is in 10th grade, and then they hit next. And then the next question is, I have an IEP. Well, most students probably know that and say yes, but some might say not sure. So let's say they click not sure, and then it gives them an answer. It says, that's okay. The app is a tool to help students and their families participate in planning for the future. You may want to contact your school counselor, a principal, or a teacher close to you to find out if you have an IEP. But chances are, if you as special ed teachers are presenting this to your students, they're going to answer yes. And then it says, great, your IEP is your individualized education program. Your IEP is discussed at your IEP team meetings where school professionals, your parents, educational advocate, and you meet to discuss your educational hopes and dreams. And maybe students won't read all that. Maybe they won't have the capacity to read all that, but parents can, right? So again, it's like teaching them, or you could read it to them, your students, and then you'd hit next. And then the next question is, I attend my IEP meetings. So depending on how the student answers, if they say, yes, it'll say, great, this app will help produce a written document detailing what your transition plan will. If they happen to say no, it says, well, it's your right to attend and speak out. Remember, at age 14, they have to be invited. So this kind of fosters that idea of, you're 14 now. We really encourage you to be part of your IEP. So let's say they answered yes. Then it says, the next question is, I share ideas and I participate in my IEP meeting. I would say most students who haven't done it will say no. And then it says, well, it's important that you speak out. If you don't speak up, your IEP team won't know what you want. If a student clicks yes, it says, great, keep up the good work. So that's just really feedback for them, right? Next question. And now we're on 5 of 15. Classes I am good at or I would like to take. So, we have a whole list of classes here. So the student gets to choose. I love, let's say they love computer science. So they're going to click that one. And they also love technology and engineering, let's say. So they click these things that they really like. Then it says, I'm interested in information for jobs in the following career clusters. So this is where, there has to be some work up front around awareness around different careers. So hopefully the student has done some assessments around careers. Maybe it's U Science that they did with in their CCA class in 7th grade or some other assessment. But, this person likes computer science, so that they might want to get into informational technology or maybe science, technology, and engineering, right? So they can click those things. And then there's some fields where they have to type. So what kind of job do you want after high school? So maybe it's IT, software development. So they can type things in here. And if they can't type it, someone else can certainly do that for them. Skills that they're good at. And again, we didn't want students to think, oh, if they're not good at academics, that they don't have other valuable skills. So we put in here organization, working with people, dependable, punctual, working with my hands, communicating, like all these other things that are strengths and skills they might be good at that aren't necessarily academic in nature, right? But students don't always think about that because they're not thinking careers and other things. So maybe the student is like, they can focus for a long time on the computer. So focus is a strength of theirs, and maybe they're really dependable. They're always on time because they're like a rule follower, right? So they can put those kinds of things in, and then they hit next. The next question is, I want to continue my education or job training. So this is about, what do they want to do post-secondary in terms of more education? So there's the whole gamut here, 4-year college, 2-year college, technical college, even church mission is in here, go in the military. And then they do have the option to say other, like maybe they want to start their own business. I don't know, or some other training that we haven't covered here. So they get to choose these things, but let's say the student wants to go to a 2-year college. They could actually list, if they know exactly what college they want to go to, they can type that in. I want further education and training in, I'm going to say in IT, just for the sake of time, I'll make that easy. And then this next one is, I may need help in the following areas to prepare for my future education and training. So, have a conversation about like, well, when you go to college, your IEP doesn't follow you and you don't have a special ed teacher and there aren't paraeducators. So what kind of help might I need, right? Maybe it's assistive technology. Maybe it's some learning studies and skill support. So there's a lot here, and some of these vocabulary might be things that they've never heard of. So this is where you want to use the paper version and really start to teach some of these things before you just, present the app to them. So I'm not going to go through all of it. This is 7 of 15, but you get the idea. I would say go for it. Like, have fun with this app. Jump in, pick a student in your head or make one up and go through it and see how that draft plan gets generated. And hopefully you will find this a helpful tool for those students that, have a transition plan, so 14 and older. I'd say for the younger students, definitely want to use those other resources I shared with you around I'm determined. So really starting with self-awareness and setting goals and choice making and those kinds of things. That's kind of like the beginning step, I think, to self-determination for sure. And then this really is the ultimate, like we want students to be really involved in their transition IEP. And this is a great tool. You don't have to use it, certainly. There's other ones out there. but it's already built for you. And so I would love some feedback if you have time to jump in and try this with students. We have found that a lot of our educators really do like it. So anyway, that's it for this week around self-determination and student-led IEPs. I mean, we literally could spend like hours and hours on this, but we don't have that kind of time. But I hope that I've provided you with enough resources. And please, if you have questions, I've always got those Monday office hours if you want to pop in there, or any other time I can make myself available too. So I hope you all have a great week and have enjoyed this week's topic. And we'll see you next week.